Those kind words of introduction. Hi, everybody. Hi. Pleasure to be here. I was telling Christina last night, I have never been to Columbia before until last night, so great to be here. I'm one of those people who knows the names of all the exits on Route 95, you know, but I've never actually been here, so it's great to be here. And I know we have people from all over the state, and I understand a couple of other states have snuck in, and I also understand we've got Baptists in the house, and Lutherans in the house, and Episcopalians, and a bunch of other folks, so we're glad to have you all. Have you all met the people right next to you? Could we take 30 seconds, just find out who's next to you and make sure they feel comfortable in your presence? And if I could I ask you all to stand, please? And since today we will not only be doing a lot of thinking and talking, but we're doing this as people of Christian faith and commitment, I thought we'd begin with a little version of singing the Lord's Prayer that I've been teaching folks a lot of different places. We're going to use some unfamiliar words to the prayer on purpose because, but I think they're faithful to the prayer's essential meaning. But I think, isn't it true we often go on autopilot? We just, our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. I mean, it's tragic to rush through the Lord's Prayer like that. And then we're going to sing it, and it's going to be very easy. We'll just sing each line on one note. So we'll sing, Our Father above us and all around us. Try that. Our Father above us and all around us. Once more. Our Father above us and all around us. Then we'll just take a breath because we're not in a hurry. And then we'll go up a note. May your unspeakable name be revered. So we're going to go up 5 notes and then back down. When we get to the 5th, if you go up to the 6th, it'll be a train wreck. So be sure you come back down. So we're going to go up 5, da 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 da, like that, okay? And we'll just sing it and let the words sink in and let it actually not just be a song, but also our prayer as we begin this day. And by the way, if someone has told you many times in the past that you're good at singing, you could throw a harmony in. If this is your opinion, let somebody else throw the harmony in, okay? But if you want to throw in a 3rd, that's okay. If you want to throw in a 5th or a 6th, if you got good instincts, you'll figure that out. If you throw in a major 7th or a 9th, we will experience Pentecostal jazz. Okay, it should be fine too. That'll be easier as we go along. But let's let this be our prayer as we begin this day. Our Father above us and all around us, may your unspeakable name be revered. Now here on earth may your commonwealth come. On earth as in heaven may your will be done. Give us today our bread for today. Forgive us our wrongs as we forgive. Lead us away from the perilous trial. Liberate us from the evil. For the kingdom is yours and yours alone. The power is yours and yours alone. The glory is yours and yours alone. Now and forever. Amen. Now here on earth may your commonwealth come. Here on earth may your dreams come true. Hallelujah. Have a moment of silence together, opening our hearts to God and to what God wants to bring us today. opening our hearts to one another because the gifts of God come to us through the people of God. Opening ourselves to receive because we all have needs. Opening ourselves to give because each of us can be the channel of encouragement, hospitality to one another. And Lord, we thank you for this day, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for exactly this group of people to be together at this stage in our lives, individually and together in this beautiful place. We thank you for our hosts, people who've made this day possible, and now we receive what you want to offer us all in Christ's name. Amen. Amen. Be seated, please. My life these last 30 years, I was a pastor for 24 years, and now I've been out of the pastor for going on 6, has really been this feeling of tension caught between something real and something wrong, becoming increasingly aware that this thing that we call Christianity is actually a whole range of Christianities. I mean, when you think of the difference between what you could see late last night on cable television, of religious broadcasting, how to get rich through Jesus, to what you see in what you're trying to do in your local church, to, you know, you think of the institutional forms and very non-institutional forms, such a range of things under this umbrella of Christianity. And we think about all the struggles that are going on in our Christian faith. I mean, I was just in Amsterdam, Netherlands, a couple of weeks ago, and I was exposed to kind of the underbelly of Christianity there, meeting a number of some of the African immigrant churches, which are doing wonderful things in many parts of the world. But there are literally now mafias of what Pentecostals there call them Pentecostal mafias, because they're organized crime networks using churches as fronts to get money out of people. I mean, it's staggering. And when you think of just the ways that Christian faith has been in our own history and could be in our own future, used for violent and hostile ends, all of us are aware that there's just a great struggle going on for the soul of what it means to be a Christian. And when you think of, when I look back on my books since I started writing in 1998, you know, you can just see kind of a quest, a search to get what it really is our story, what is our real message, what is our way, what is the heart of our spirituality. And I've become convinced that some of our theological problems are modular. You know, you can take out the old module and stick in a new one. I mean, you can, in a sense, you can replace a verse of a hymn, you can replace a hymnal, you can. Do you ever feel this, all the clergy in the room? Clergy are sometimes a bit modular. You know, you take us out and plug us in somewhere else. And sometimes it seems like the machinery just keeps going, whoever's plugged into the slot. Although we all know it's a lot more complex than that. But I think others of our issues are much more systemic. And there's delicate balances, and every part is interrelated to the other parts. And not only that, but the church itself it always exists in a context and in a culture, and there's permeability between the two. And so there are changes going on in our world: economic, political, technological, cultural, sociological, ecological. Every dimension of life we sense is going through some profound shift. Nobody said it better than probably the closest thing we've had in the last generation to a Renaissance man, Václav Havel, who said, "Something is on the way out and something else is painfully being born. It is as if something were crumbling, decaying, and exhausting itself, while something else, still indistinct, were rising from the rubble. We're in a phase when one age is succeeding another, when everything is possible." You just think of how that's happening in so many different levels. You think of what we see on the news night after night, or morning after morning, or website after website, however you get your news, and you think we're seeing evidence of these profound shifts going on. And so today we're going to try to grapple with what some of those shifts are going to mean in our lives. Did I just lose?
No.
We're okay. We're going to grapple with what those mean. In each of our sessions, I would like to speak for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have all the rest of the time for questions and discussion. So a lot of this day will depend on all of you. I'd kind of like to make a deal with you this morning as we begin that will be in effect for the rest of our time together. Maybe a kind of a pact together. And here's the pact. I could be very careful to avoid offending anybody or avoid saying anything that could be misconstrued. And it would be a safe day, but a little boring. And if I could have the freedom to speak very freely, and assuming that you'll disagree with me on some things that I say and that you're probably right 9 times out of 10, but the value for you will be the one time when maybe you understand. If we can have that kind of a deal, for me that would be a more enjoyable day, but I also think it would be more productive for you all. I am very comfortable with people who think I'm wrong about things. I'm actually interested in that. So I won't be offended at all if we can have some good-natured pushback, if we can just be open, because we're all in this thing together and a lot's at stake. And so if I can just have a tone, I'm not mad at anybody, I'm not fighting with anybody, I'm deeply concerned about some things. And if I can share that concern, I'd like to have a bit of the role with you all of an informant, because I've been in something like 40 countries in the last 12 or 14 years. I've had the chance to be with Christian leaders from a wide range, from soup to nuts in the different denominational backgrounds. I get a chance to see what's going on in the church. I spend a lot of time, if I can be very frank, with pastors who either are holding on by a fingernail, or you would be surprised how many ex-pastors I spend time with, I meet. And I spend a lot of time with college students outside the faith trying to get in, and inside the faith trying to get out. And so I'd like to be an informant to you about things that I think are happening really across the range of our denominations. I know that a lot of us, and I think this is probably especially true here in the South, we grow up in this bipolar world of liberal and conservative, mainline, evangelical, whatever you want to call it, moderate, fundamentalist. We have all kinds of ways to describe the polarity. My suspicion is, after these years of travel, the two are less dissimilar than a lot of people realize, especially when we look at it on a sociological level. And my hunch is that although evangelicals have been watching what has been called mainline decline for about 40 years plus now, my suspicion is that we've already turned the corner, and evangelicals are now going to realize that they're actually mirroring what's happened to mainliners just 40 years or so later. And when that happens, it opens up the possibility for both groups to say, you know what, we're both in trouble. We probably have resources to offer one another that could help, but there are probably things where both of us have some major rethinking to do, and we can do that together. So if we can have that kind of collegial tone, I'd be really happy about that. And we can make this a safe space for you to ask questions and for all of us to just think as clearly as we can. If you were hoping to come today for the $39.95 box set of Church Growth Secrets, that's not my seminar, that's somebody else's. And I've got to be honest with you. I think anybody who tries to sell you a cheap box of tricks to solve our problems, they can solve some problems, but the deepest problems that we have, I think these are theological and spiritual issues that involve something far more than technique. And I hope that today we'll get a deeper sense of what those issues are. I do believe the possibilities of taking our shrinking and wrinkling church populations and seeing a new generation of Christian faith open up that welcomes in new generations of people. I think that's very, very possible. I think it's happening in some exciting ways out on the margins, but I don't think, I want us to be realistic. Today is going to be a day for not for a bag of tricks, but for maybe some soul searching and deep thinking together. There's not going to be, I don't want anybody to feel guilty from today. There's not going to be shaming or insulting going on. I don't even want us to be hard on the church as it is. My sense is that just about all churches are doing the best they can. And even their worst behavior is in many ways, it's a cry for help. And so I'd rather not be negative, and I'd rather not have the mode in our minds of saying, here's the trends that are happening and we have to adjust to them. Do you see how disempowering that is? I think there's a certain sense that when you take that approach, trends are happening, we've got to adjust. You surrender yourself to being in the reactive mode. And I think we're at a moment where the kinds of people who are in this room, people of deep faith and commitment to Jesus Christ, people with above average knowledge of church history and the inside workings of churches, realism about those things on both the positive and negative side, people who are open and willing to rethink. The future is not is something that's rolling in we have to adjust to. It actually is something we all help create. And I hope that we'll have that much more empowered mind in what we're about. And so that gives you a bit of what I hope will be ahead for the day. Okay, I'm going to structure what I say around a book I wrote that came out going on 2 years ago called A New Kind of Christianity, 10 Questions That Are Transforming the Faith. The book is built around the idea of a quest. And in many ways, I've drawn so much inspiration from a Catholic priest and missiologist and missionary named Vincent Donovan. Went from the U.S. as a Spiritan priest to the Kenya-Tanzania border in Africa back in the 1960s. And his experience there caused him to, he in a sense, was re-evangelized in the process of trying to evangelize others. And wrote a couple of brilliant books. I could tell you more about him later. But he concluded his epic work, Christianity Rediscovered, by saying, do not leave others where they are. Do not try to bring them where you are, as beautiful as that place might be. Instead, go with them to a new place neither you nor they have ever been before. And that is the spirit that I'd like us to have for this day. Now, being in a Lutheran setting, it's a good time to remember we're coming up in 2019 on the 500th anniversary of the famed 95 Theses of Martin Luther. And if you read the introduction to the 95 Theses, he says that these are intended for debate. And the goal, I think, of debate is that you destabilize the status quo, you create some new possibilities, and then you can arrive at a new state. The problem is that an unintended consequence of the debate was hate and violence. So soon, Europe was, and it wasn't only, I mean, Martin Luther was a symptom, and the Reformation was a symptom as well as a cause in many ways. But pretty soon you had the 30 Years' War erupting, and you had, for us, it's amazing how little we tell the story of the religious violence that erupted in the aftermath of the Reformation. Protestant against Protestant, Protestant against Catholic, Catholic against Protestant. And so my hunch has been that what we need now is not so much new statements that create debate to lead us to a new state, sometimes producing the byproduct of hate. We need new questions that create conversations that lead us on a new quest and have the possibility of creating the byproduct of surprising and unexpected friendships. And when you think about the difference between statements and questions, you realize that obviously questions lead us to looking for answers. They lead us to statements in some ways, but they also create a sense of movement. And one of the things that's going to come up again and again for us is, I think, especially if you're my age or older, you maybe have come to the point where you're aware that big change is needed. But I bet your assumption, and this is deep inside me too, is, okay, the status quo is messed up. We got to go through some change, and then we'll be able to get someplace else where we can say, here I stand. Or maybe even better, here I sit. right? We have this idea we want to get things fixed so that then they can be fixed. See? My hunch is that part of the change we're going to go through now, if it really does its work, it was beautifully represented by a cartoon. And the cartoon showed in the first frame 5 camels, 2 big camels, and all you can see is a silhouette. And on the 2 big camels, you can see there's a father and a mother riding along on their camels. And then there are 3 smaller camels, and you can see the kids are on the 3 smaller camels. And so in the first 3 squares or 3 frames of the cartoon, all you see is these camels going along farther and farther into the desert, and in the background you see the sun rising higher. And then in the last frame, you see the father turning around and speaking to the littlest kid on the last camel, saying, "Stop asking when we're going to get there. We're nomads." So, and of course, you know, this is one of our deep themes in the Bible. Are we, this dynamic between being people on a journey, on an exodus, following Jesus, and people of the tabernacle or the tent on the road, versus being people of the temple and the city and the static location. And this is one of our deep struggles. And so what I've experienced in my travels in recent years is a handful of questions that keep coming up again and again and again. And I've tried to kind of extract from these 10 questions that I think are especially important. We're not going to look at all 10 in our sessions. We're going to look at several of the key ones in my mind. The narrative question, we're going to look at that this morning. What really is the shape of the biblical narrative? And the authority question, how does the Bible fit into our whole authority structure? Those are the 2 we're going to look at this morning. Next is the God question, especially relating to the issue of God's violence. Is God violent? And I've got to tell you, this is the most common question I hear asked by non-Christians exploring the faith, by Christians troubled about staying in the faith, and by pastors who are also troubled. This is a huge question. Fourth, and closely related, is the Jesus question. Who is Jesus and why does he matter? We'll also be looking at that this afternoon. And then the gospel question. Obviously, if you answer those first 4, depending on how you answer those first 4 questions, you'll answer that 5th question in very different ways. The church question, that's what we'll be talking about tonight. 7th is the sex question, and I'm especially interested in the sex question, not just on the question of homosexuality, but it's interesting to ask, why is that question so important and difficult and almost irreconcilable when people start grappling with it? What is it about that question that is touching such a it's touching us so deeply? 8th is the future question. This is our question of eschatology. I continue to think this is one of those issues. It really relates to this idea of getting things fixed so they can be fixed. We have a deeply embedded set of assumptions about eschatology that I think are up for question now. 9th, this is actually the one that I'm kind of obsessed with right now, because my next book is the one I'm working on right now, is about how to have Christian identity in a world of many different religious identities. And that issue is huge for me, and we'll touch on it a little bit tomorrow morning. And then how can we, the 10th question is, how can we address the first 9 questions without killing each other? So that's the shape of what we'll be doing. And so we're going to be putting ourselves into tension, not only the tension that a lot of people feel, which is the tension between how things are and how things used to be. A whole lot of people are in that tension, but we're going to add the element how things are versus how things could, should, might be in the future. And that's basically some introduction. This first question is, of the 10, it's the only one I've never had anybody ask me. But I'm quite certain that it is the underlying question behind all the others. It's our assumption about what the biblical narrative is. And for those of you who've read this book, I need to tell you, I'm not just going to summarize the book. I'm going to throw in some sort of new stuff, and so hopefully that will be of use to you. But I need to do a bit of review for those of you who have read the book. But my suspicion is that most of you, especially if you're from an evangelical or a conservative Catholic background, probably conservative Lutheran backgrounds, you could fill in this plot diagram for the biblical story without, even if you've never seen it graphically displayed this way before. We kind of know the shape of the biblical story. And to question or doubt this is pretty much unacceptable in an awful lot of settings. I became suspicious about this. My background is in literature. I was a college English teacher. I love literature. And when I started trying to piece together what is the big plot line, is there a big plot line in the biblical story, I remember having one of those sort of aha moments. This could never be proven. This is highly contested. A few people throw this out right away. But my suspicion is this is not actually the biblical narrative. This is actually Plato's narrative of the cave. And what this really tells the story is the fall or descent into the cave and getting out of the cave. Now, if you know a lot about Platonic philosophy, that'll make sense. If you don't worry about it. Except to say that Greek philosophy, as we know, historically became extremely useful to the Roman political system. Well, first to the Greek Empire, and then to the Roman Empire. And for the Romans, one of the ideas that was drawn from that Greek philosophical system, which, by the way, I don't think we should blame Plato for. It's really the system that grows from Plato. And you know, Plato is so brilliant that people who devote their entire lives to understanding him passionately disagree with each other about what he was about. But derived from this came the idea that there is an ideal state, and that ideal state is with us in charge. And us was the Romans, when the Romans came into power, the Pax Romana. And the only way to have peace is to have us in charge. And when you get us in charge, to mess that up is going to send us back into the realm of barbarism and chaos once again. So the philosophical idea had a very powerful political outworking. Now, I wrote this book in 2000. It came out in 2010. In 2010, after the book came out, I was invited by a group who are theologians and philosophers who are interested in the work of a French philosopher named René Girard. I don't know how many of you are familiar with René Girard. And I'd read a bit of Girard, but mostly I'd read about him through other people. So they invited me to speak. I said, yes, I'll be glad to speak. And then a couple months later, they said, well, if you're going to speak to our group, you have to read at least 5 or 10 of his books. So suddenly I had a lot of homework. The process of more deeply reading Girard even strengthened my sense of the struggles of these 10 questions, but especially this first question. René Girard, in a book called Things Hidden, I should actually tell you a bit about Girard. He's still alive, although I understand he's very frail now and is sort of beyond his working years. But he was a French literary critic, anthropologist, philosopher. Has taught for many years at I guess it's USC. But he is a brilliant thinker who became obsessed with an idea in the 1960s and has stayed with that idea for his whole career. And it's really the question of the role of violence in human societies. It's very fascinating. And he started without a deep Christian insight or commitment. His process, he first was engaging with ancient myths, then started to engage with what we might call primitive cultures around the world. And then that led him to read the Bible. And then everything changed for him when he read the Bible with this sensitivity to the theme of violence. And so he wrote, the philosopher Heidegger is absolutely right to state that there has never been any thought in the West but Greek thought, even when the labels were Christian. Christianity has no special existence in the domain of thought. Now, this might be an overstatement. He's often accused of that, but he gets his point across. Continuity with the Greek logos has never been interrupted. Everything is Greek and nothing is Christian. So Girard, we're going to come back to a number of to Girard a number of times, just because I wanted to throw something new for those of you who've already read the book. So Girard is in agreement that the Christian faith, in many ways, at a certain point in the Western tradition, ironically, the Eastern tradition, this is less true. And when you get to the Coptic and African traditions, it's even less true. It's sort of ironic. But there was less of a wholehearted commitment to a certain kind of Neoplatonism. And what Girard is grappling with here is the Greek idea of logos, the Greek idea of order and the meaning and core word of the universe, the coherence of the universe. He says the Christian faith has not offered an alternative to that. It has in many ways become a chaplaincy to it. And so he goes on to say, if love and violence are incompatible, the definition of the logos must take this into account. The difference between the Greek logos, which is always violent, which achieves, and in its Roman form, achieves peace through the ultimate violence of torture and mass killing. The Greek violent logos, he says, and the logos of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Christian logos, there would have to be an obvious difference. But he says the fact that there isn't an obvious difference basically tells us something is wrong. He talks about this as cultural Platonism, the unexamined conviction that human institutions have been and are what they are for all eternity, that they have little need to evolve and none whatsoever to be engendered, because the original state was changelessness. We've fallen into this time of change, but we're looking forward to returning to this state of changelessness. So the backdrop reality, the ultimate reality, is a non-evolutionary, static, changeless reality. And he says it is quite evident how a universal Platonism manages to obscure any phenomena that contradict it, such as the existence of an evolving universe. Anyway, so that raises for me the question, to what degree is what we call orthodoxy the version of the faith? Now, look, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I believe in the creeds. But I'm talking about when we think about Orthodox Christianity, the version of the faith that has proved most useful in supporting the apparatus of this Greco-Roman civilization. Empire and colonialism, tyranny, denomination, rule by elites, mystification, co-option, environmental exploitation. And then we'd have to ask them, how have our most cherished doctrines and our basic understanding of the biblical narrative, could they have been in some ways co-opted or captured in service of somebody else's story? And is there an alternative understanding? And my proposal in the New Kind of Christianity that I'm seeing being raised by different groups around the world. This first, I don't know if this is true historically, but it gets on the scene in South Africa in the 60s and 70s in the struggle against apartheid through what became what we now today would call black theology there. It simultaneously is being discovered by Dr. King and in the civil rights movement here in the United States, also under the term black theology. Similarities, slight differences. And right around the same time is getting explored in Latin America under the title liberation theology. And all of them make, and by the way, since then, got picked up in feminist theology, eco-feminist theology. There's a huge, exciting movement of indigenous Christian movements like Native Americans, First Nations in Canada, Polynesians, Maori, these different, I know among Lutherans up in northern Sweden and northern Norway, the indigenous peoples there, there's a rediscovery of their identity as not part of the Greek and Roman tradition, and saying this gives us a unique angle in on the Christian faith. The whole rediscovery of Celtic Christianity, also a non-Greco-Roman grappling with the faith. And so in all of these different places, they're saying, you know, what we have done is we read the Bible backwards and we try to understand Jesus in terms of his descendants. So we have Jesus out there, but we see Jesus through the sight line. And so today, somebody wants to learn about Jesus, and they go on television and they see Benny Hinn, who is the most popular Christian in the world, most powerful Christian in the world, I think. You might, if you don't know who he is, it just tells you, you know, you're on the margins here. But I mean, around the world, he has more, I think, has far more day-to-day street cred than the Pope. Incredibly powerful, along with Joyce Meyer and a lot of the other prosperity gospel preachers who are not only seen around the world through television, but are emulated around the world through pastors who are, I mean, they're just incredibly powerful. And by the way, you said it's not just Pentecostals. Episcopalians and Lutherans in Africa have to come to terms with Benny Hinn and so on. So you come through the sight line, and you don't even realize whenever Benny Hinn says Jesus, this is the Benny Hinn perspective on Jesus, which is influenced by the Kenneth Hagin, who you might not know, but becomes an important figure because of his influence, which he might not even know this, but he is entering into the tradition of 19th century American revivalism, which draws from John Wesley, which draws from Martin Luther, which draws from Anselm, from Aquinas and Anselm and Augustine. And so there's this whole sight line of the faith that when we say Jesus, we're seeing Jesus through the sight line. Something happens when we reverse the sight line and say, well, how about if we try to understand Jesus instead through his ancestors? So we start by putting Jesus in the story of Abraham, and then put Jesus in the story of Moses, and then put Jesus in the story of David, and then put Jesus in the story of Isaiah and the other prophets, and then put Jesus in the story of John the Baptist. And when we situate Jesus in that story drawing from his ancestors, and we privilege that story, then we can at least face the tensions between these two ways of understanding Jesus. And when that happens, there are a few points that you can reach very quick and deep agreement on, but here's one of them. The primary narrative of the Hebrew Scriptures is Exodus, is the story of God liberating slaves from Egypt. Now look, I'm aware that in higher critical circles and all the rest, there are all kinds of questions about the historicity of this and so on, but there's no question in the biblical text, the understanding of Exodus, the identity of the people of God as the people who were liberated from slavery in Egypt. That is the main storyline. And I don't know if you ever thought of it this way before, but what's so radical about that storyline is it says when God looks into history and sees slave owners and slaves, God does not side with the slave owners, God sides with the slaves. That is a revolutionary story. It's revolutionary, by the way, in 2011. And it's part of what we're seeing play out in Occupy Wall Street and so on. Where is God's power? On the forces, with the forces of the status quo who are keeping an order of sorts? Or is it with the people who say, this order isn't fair? And it might be prosperous and profitable for some people, but for other people it's not. Where is God? I mean, this is a live issue today. And that is an absolutely revolutionary idea. God is not on the side of preserving the status quo. God is on the side of opening things up to make room for the people who are on the bottom. It's powerful. And I don't know if you ever thought of it this way, but the book of Exodus is set up, the first half of the first movement is the liberation of the slaves from slavery, which happens through 10 plagues. And then the rest of Exodus is about the liberation of the slaves, the internal liberation, getting the slavery out of the slaves, and that happens through 10 commands. And so you have these sort of the symmetry of external and internal liberation becomes the primary narrative. But of course then you have the sequel, or the prequel to that narrative, kind of the episode 1 to Star Wars. How did we get into slavery in the first place? And that's really the question that Genesis answers. And it becomes the prequel narrative, and it's the narrative of God as creator and God as reconciler. And we can talk about this more in a couple of minutes, but we've been so deeply trained to read the book of Genesis through the eyes of that 6-line narrative, that when you start rediscovering Genesis in another shape and in another narrative space, it becomes, I think, 100 times more carbonated and effervescent. And then, of course, Exodus ends with people walking through the wilderness. A big "to be continued" sign comes up on the screen. So we know there's got to be a sequel. And that sequel begins with the development of the Promised Land. But it doesn't take long in the Promised Land for the people of God to discover that having your own land isn't that great if all of your neighbors want a piece of it. That having milk and honey just makes you the target for occupation. So you start dreaming not of just having a promised land, as important as that is, but of a promised time when nation will not rise up against nation, and the nations will study war no more, but people will all be able to sit under their vine and fig tree, so nobody will make anybody else afraid. That vision, which is articulated by all the prophets in various ways, but I pick Isaiah because he's quoted by far the most in the New Testament. This vision changes from promised land to promised time, and of course gets picked up by Jesus as this message of the kingdom of God, a time, a reign of justice and mercy. Now my proposal, this is totally playful. I'm not seriously suggesting this, but if you were to think of length and width and height, 3 dimensions, if you combine these 3 storylines, perhaps what we envision then is not a single storyline, but rather a story space, a matrix in which thousands of stories can happen. And in that story space, it's not an anything goes expanding universe. If you oppose creation, and if you oppose liberation, and if you oppose reconciliation, then you're trying to box in the ongoing fertile, fecund universe that God is making. And in so doing, you're then participating in sin and evil. And in that context, we're going to talk about this more this afternoon, in that context, if we try to understand Jesus and the gospel and the church and Christian identity, in that framework, it is a very different framework than that 6-line narrative that we mentioned earlier. And I think we've seen the possibility of changing stories. We've seen it unfold many places. South Africa is an interesting example, because that kind of single storyline that always favors a certain group of people, that storyline was challenged in the 1980s, and in 1990, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, in some ways that represented the abandonment of a storyline, of a certain storyline, and open up the possibility for new stories. And in the 4 years between then and the birth of the new South Africa, you could see the old story being replaced by a new story. These photographs are from the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. If you ever get a chance to go, it's really worth seeing. I mean, this is what you see when you enter that kind of tells a story in and of itself. And when you come out, you see these 6 pillars: freedom, respect, responsibility, diversity, reconciliation, and democracy. And these 6 pillars represent the beginning of a new South Africa. Now they're already rusting, which tells you it's a whole lot easier to name the 6 things than actually keep them alive and going. And I don't know if you heard, Desmond Tutu is so angry at the current government because they refused entry to the Dalai Lama, who is his friend. And they refused entry probably because they are major trading partners with China. And by receiving the Dalai Lama, this will make their major trading partner angry. And so Desmond Tutu is saying, you know, you guys, this is a fraud, and we're just back where we were before, even worse, because we don't know that we're back where we were before. But be that as it may, that struggle to find a new story became very graphic for me when I then got to go to Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela had been kept as a prisoner for all those years. And there's, in the center of Robben Island, it's this bleak, desolate little island. In the center is a rock quarry where the political prisoners were forced to go and break rocks. I mean, just the classic the classic work of getting you tired for no purpose and helping you feel your futility to break rocks. And after all the big changes, and after Mandela was elected president, he sent the word out. And it was interesting. He said, we're going to have a reunion at Robben Island. And all the people who ever were political prisoners, we're going to ask you to come back to Robben Island to celebrate what happened. And I met a guy when I was there who had been a prisoner. And he said, when we were at Robben Island, we called it our alma mater. Because while we sat around in the prison, breaking rocks and sitting in the cold cells, because it's a harsh place to live, he said, we called it the School of Democracy. And we said, this is where we are going to envision a different South Africa, the South Africa of tomorrow, a nonviolent South Africa, a different South Africa, beyond apartheid and racism. So when they had the reunion, the class reunion at their alma mater, they were asked each to bring a stone from their own home village. And this is the pile of stones in the middle of that rock quarry, which just seemed to me to have that sort of image of an Old Testament altar, a way of saying, we were part of a dream here that has now begun to come into fruition. And this, I think, is part of our struggle now. We have to, in the middle of the chaos and struggle of these times, imagine what the Christian faith could be like if it discovered a new narrative. Someone who got me thinking about this was another Catholic theologian, Ivan Illich. He was a priest and then left the priesthood in protest. Although when he left the priesthood, he said, I'm asking to be released of my vows. I'm no longer a priest, but I will maintain the vow of celibacy, which I don't get how that worked, but he did. He remained celibate after leaving the priesthood. But he said these words, neither revolution nor reformation can ultimately change a society. Rather, you must tell a powerful new tale, one so persuasive that it sweeps away the old myths and becomes a preferred story, one so inclusive that it gathers all the bits of our past and present into a coherent whole, one that even shines some light into the future so that we can take the next step. If you want to change a society, then you have to tell an alternative story. And this was Illich's way, as a deeply committed Christian, of saying that we have to rediscover the real storyline that underlies our texts and underlies our understanding of Jesus and the gospel, and that makes possible not only a new story for us in the church, but then this becomes the story that we offer to the world. And I think we'd all agree our world is in desperate need of a better story to live by and by which to frame our lives. Well, a whole lot of places we can go there, and we will in our next session. But let me stop there, and we've got plenty of time now for some questions, dialogue, pushback. Would you do me a quick favor? If you'll just pick one person, or if there's three of you right together, two people, just pull together for about 30 seconds, about a minute, let's say, and just was there an idea here that's interesting to you? Was this over your head? Just what's your reaction? What's your kind of response to what you've heard? And just talk to each other about that for a minute or two, and then we'll pull back together. So jump in. Okay, let's pull back together in just a minute here. Now, in a room this size, we've got great acoustics in here. I think everybody will be able to hear your question, but if you can keep it short enough that I could repeat it, that would be great. And we've got mics everywhere. Fantastic. So if you have a mic and you hit the touch button, I guess it'll turn on and you can ask your question. And everybody definitely will hear it. So who'd like to ask the first question? And if anybody's nervous because it's a room this size, we can just skip the first question and go to the second question. So that might help us. Yes, and give me your name too.
Lance Henderson. I'm a pastor over in West Columbia, just across the river, and was trained here at Southern. You were speaking about in terms of the narratives, which is always kind of a linear progression sort of thing. But if we take, coming at it this direction or that direction, of course we meet Jesus right there at the center of it. And looking then, if we say that the Christian notion of logos is kind of an add-on of the Greek, a kind of a progression in that big story. But what if the Greek logos exist to prefigure the Christian logos? Yeah. I mean, cannot that Pauline fullness of time be represented in both the history of the Israelite people and the Greek philosophy that's dominant at the...
That's a great question. Your first name again was?
Lance.
Lance. First of all, Lance, it's a fantastic question. And in fact, this was the big struggle in the first few centuries of the Christian faith. How is this new movement going to relate to the dominant culture of the Greco-Roman world? And you had radically different answers among the early church leaders. Tatian came along, and I guess this is the very early in the second century, and he says, Christianity is a barbarian religion, and we're proud of it. In other words, you can have your Roman civilization. It's violent, it's harsh, it's intimidating, and we don't want any part of it. We're barbarians, and you use that as a term of insult for us. We take it as a badge of pride. That's sort of the Tatian's response. And then but within decades, you have Justin Martyr and others who are taking a very different response. And they're saying, Jesus is the fulfillment of the Greek philosophers. Socrates was a Christian before Christ. And so over the first centuries, you just have this argument raging how we're going to interact. So I'm really glad you raised the question. Let me clarify, because I'm going to come back to this in the next session, what I think René Girard was saying. René Girard was saying he thinks in the Gospel of John, in that first chapter, that when John uses the word logos, he is not saying, I'm going to fit Jesus into the categories of Greek philosophy. He's saying, the Greeks and Romans offer you one logos. We're offering you a radically different logos. Theirs is a logos of changelessness, domination, and violence. Ours is a logos of reconciliation, which always means change, and rebirth, which always means change, new beginnings, and it's a logos of love. And so Girard is a little more like Tatian in this way. He's saying, no, this is a radical discontinuity, not a radical continuity. Now, probably, if we're going to be balanced about it, we'd have to say, well, there are good things in Greco-Roman culture that the gospel would come and affirm. And yet there are also things that it would critique, and we probably want to have that balance, and I think that's kind of what you're hitting. Does that make sense? I'm really glad you bring that up. But this has huge implications for us because we have a dominant culture, and we're trying to figure out, and our dominant culture has been highly Christianized, especially, I live in Florida now, so I live in the South, so I feel this more than I used to. But our dominant culture has been highly Christianized, but we're always struggling with how much is that word and how much is that essence. So, great question. Yes?
Yeah.
Would you hit your little mic there? Thanks.
I don't know how to make it work.
You've only got it upside down, but that's how we all feel a lot of times. So.
Yeah, my name is John Carpenter, and I'm a member of St. Francis of Assisi Episcopal Church in Chapin, South Carolina. And I come from a science background. And I come from the science of geology. And it's just occurred to me that, you know, one of the things that we seem to have problems, there are a lot of people seem to have problems with, is the whole idea that as the title of one of your other books says, Christianity must change. And it just, if you think about it, it really is the same theme that we see throughout all history. Of the universe has evolved and is evolving. Life has evolved and is evolving. Christianity, to me, must evolve and is evolving.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Well, I think this is exactly where this issue of what René Girard called, now I forgot his term for the Platonic culture, you know, this what I'm calling a Greco-Roman culture, how this is one of the reasons why evolution was so hard to accept, and why in geology, as they started to realize sedimentation was telling us our history. And one of the reasons it's been so hard to accept is because our theological assumptions had been inherited from some brilliant Greek philosophers. That wasn't their assumption. And now we're figuring out, are we allowed to be unfaithful to those assumptions? And this opens up fascinating new possibilities within Christian theology, one of which is, I'm sure many of you are already deeply engaged with this, but there's a whole, it's called New Trinitarianism. The irony is, it's a recovery of the Cappadocian Fathers in many ways, but it's a rediscovery of Trinitarian theology. It says in the idea of Trinity is the idea of a dynamic community of persons who have a life. It's not a static hierarchical relationship, but it's almost like imagining, you know, the atoms and, you know, whirling around. Or planets and the sun. It's an image of movement and a spiraling dance, that sort of a thing. And so this is exactly the kind of thing that we're grappling with. And it's one of the reasons why, on very practical terms, when a person walks into a church building and they feel they've entered into an envelope of the past preserved in the present, whether that past is the 1950s or the 1630s or whatever it is, but when they feel that that's happened, it's not just a matter of taste, even though for some people they'll articulate it as a matter of taste. There's something deeper than a matter of taste going on. They're confronting an assumption that there is a pinnacle that has been reached, and it's got to be maintained, and any change can only go downward. Yes?
Don Flowers, I'm a pastor down in Charleston, South Carolina. Your last line made me think of a quote by David Walsh, who's done brain research up in Minneapolis. His thing is, the one who tells the story shapes the culture, if you want to change society. But the implications to that, what do you do, and I may be jumping ahead, what do you do with that story, with our story, this Christian story, which in many ways has become a Platonic story, and it's almost, how do you take the tentacles that have wedged in there out without destroying the story, or what do you do when you say, I'm going to give you a totally different story?
Yes. Does everybody feel that question? Well, first let's consider our options. I mean, one option that's frequently taken is to abandon Christian faith entirely, to say the whole project has lost its credibility. It really is just the chaplaincy to an empire. And even though it isn't always expressed that way, I think that's part of the rise of the new atheism. It's another rejection of a kind of religion that they sense always leads to violence and doesn't offer anything new. In less extreme forms, it becomes a kind of pluralistic nominalism that says it doesn't really matter what you believe, just sincerity is all that matters, just believe something. And in some ways, that isn't offering a very strong story either, but it's trying to weaken a story that's seen as destructive. So we have a range of responses in that direction. Of course, then there are other people who are saying, this is the story, we got to preach it harder and louder than ever. And this especially works when you start to say, and those Muslims are coming around and they got another story, and it's our story versus their story. We end up with rivalry of stories, and we're seeing where that leads. You know, my proposal, I mean, just to tell you where I'm coming from, my proposal is, I think I understand why people take these other options, but my proposal, I feel a little bit like Peter and the disciples after Jesus said those very inflammatory words in John 6 about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, and everybody gets grossed out and offended, and that sounds too extreme and too crazy, and so people start leaving, and then he says, oh, are you guys going too? And Peter says, where else would we go? You're the only ones with the words of eternal life. And so my personal feeling at a moment like this is, I feel we have to go back and try to rediscover some understanding in our text of an alternative narrative that truly is good news. And I think when you start getting a second look at Jesus, which is part of what we'll do this afternoon, that actually happens. But then we have a very tricky process. And what's so interesting about this to me is all of our heroes, this is what they did. I mean, we could go way back, even look at figures like Abraham and Moses in this context. But you look at Jesus, Jesus is showing up using all the language of both his Jewish and Roman context, but he's flipping it all on its head. He's turning it around and revolutionizing it. So this is what Jesus does. And you might say, yeah, but it didn't turn out so well for him. And I'd like to have a good career, you know. And this is a dangerous proposition. But you even think of people like St. Francis, and we have this sort of idyllic picture of St. Francis as this nice guy with bird on his finger, you know, and all the rest. But, you know, St. Francis came into a highly contested period where for over 100 years there have been these movements that were seeking to discredit the powers that be, the religious industrial complex centered at the Vatican, or centered in Rome. It wasn't centered, I think the architecture was different then, but centered in Rome. The way they tried to discredit it was by saying Jesus was poor. And can you see when you say Jesus was poor, you are undermining the credibility of the entire religious system, which has become opulent and rich. And so wave after wave, Jesus is poor, and they get crushed because there often is violence involved in crushing them. And some of them were violent as well, to be honest, in their reactions. St. Francis comes along with complete nonviolence. He doesn't say Jesus is poor. He says, I'll be poor. And in so doing, subverts the attempts to, he gets around it, creatively finds some other way to get through with his message. And I think we're in a similar situation. This is our great challenge. And one of our great problems, and this is, I think, what we all struggle with, is if we're oppositional in our way of doing it, they're wrong, we're right. We're caught into the whole matrix because that kind of oppositional identity is part of what we're fighting against. So we have to find other ways to articulate this story in fresh ways. And can I just say that's one of the reasons for all of you who are pastors, and the practical question you're facing is, all of our people are over 55, or all of our people are over 65, or all our people are over 45, or whatever it is, and you're saying, how do we reach out to younger generations? That very practical question. Your problem is, many of the people who are paying your bills and paying your salary are so sure that the story is that 6-line story that for you to propose an alternative will be betraying what they're paying you to promote. And this calls for, I think it calls for you to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. Suddenly that language comes very much alive again. And it calls for the creative process that Jesus used, which involved indirect communication, speaking in parables, sowing seeds, getting the message through. It involves pulling people aside and working with the people who are more ready to move forward, which is why Jesus was constantly trying to get away from the crowds with his disciples. And it involves a very, very delicate process that's not without threat and danger. Yes?
Someone stole the microphone.
Oh, okay.
As one hopes to gain a glimpse of the alternative narrative that you've been talking about, once one begins to be formed in a new story or in this new narrative, like kudzu, I think our tendency is to start putting down roots, and we begin to establish a new status quo. So my question, in what you were saying, how do we remain the nomads on the journey and stop asking if we've gotten there
yes.
yet?
Well, this to me is this is $1 million question. Your first name is?
Bob Hawkins.
Bob. Pardon me?
I'm part of the seminary.
Oh, beautiful, Bob. This is to me. This is $1 million question that I think I have two contradictory answers to, just in my own intuition on this. One is part of what looks like setting down roots is necessary because it involves drawing nourishment and keeping this. There's a nourishment that has to happen. And so, for example, one of the things I think we desperately need is we need curriculum for children and youth that gives them a coherent alternative understanding of the biblical narrative. So we have all these adults rethinking things, but they send their kids to Sunday school, and in Sunday school, very often they're getting the old narrative out of the box in more fancier and fancier ways, more colorful and better graphics and increased multimedia and all the rest. But there hasn't been a lot of thought about this. In fact, if I can just give an example of just that specific thing. When in the next session this afternoon, we're going to talk about this issue of the violence of God and relating to how do we deal with violent passages in the Bible. And a lot of us grew up with this. I'm sure some of us in the room, we've never really thought about this until now, and I'm really sorry I'm the one who has to mess up your life. But we really have something to deal with these violent passages in the Bible. So I was at a publishing house of a major mainline denomination not too long ago, and I was meeting with some of the editors there, and I expressed interest in meeting the children and youth curriculum people, and they showed me this beautiful new program on the life of King David that they're developing, and it's just incredible, and they're drawing wonderful moral lessons for the life of King David. And I just was in a bit of a perverse mood that day. So I said, so what do you do about King David's violence? And they got a puzzled look on their face, like, what do you mean? I said, well, you don't want kids throwing stones at people. And you don't want people killing their enemies. So how do you deal with that? And it was just clear that question had not gotten on their radar screen yet. And you might say, and part of the art of the Christian tradition is we've learned to draw value and put that on the back burner. And but the problem is, any new person coming into the faith who comes in and hears you tell a story about King David, because they've grown up in a post 9/11 world, they're going to see that and they're going to think terrorism, and they're going to think religious violence. It becomes a huge issue. You want to?
Yeah, I do, because I had a conversation last Saturday night online with some friends of mine, pastors, writing sermons, and a friend was preaching on the Noah and the Ark.
Yeah.
And he was having this struggle. What do you do, and I know I'm jumping way ahead, what do you do with the God who basically gets ticked off and kills everybody? And his thing was, what would we lose if we just tore that story out of the Bible and didn't teach it anymore? My suggestion was we would lose a great craft idea for Sunday school and the Arky Arky song.
The flannel. Okay, so here, these are two. This is a great example. By the way, we couldn't have a better setup for our afternoon session because this is where we want to go this afternoon. But let me just recount another story. So I was in that office having that experience. But a few months ago, do any of you know a group called the Network of Biblical Storytellers? An amazing group. I just highly recommend them. And the founder or organizer of the group is a fellow named Tom Boomersheim, who has one of the best names of anybody. And I'd never met Tom, but we had a mutual friend, and she set up a Skype conversation. And I said, Tom, you're doing such a great job of teaching people to dramatically portray the biblical narrative. I said, but what are you doing about violence in the biblical narrative? And Tom just dropped this little thought bomb for me. He just said it fantastic. He just said, maybe we shouldn't tell the story of David killing Goliath without also telling the story of David not being able to build the temple because he was a man of bloodshed. Oh. Suddenly, you start to think, there's something very interesting going on. Well, since Tom Boomersheim said that to me, I've just had, every time I read the Bible, I'm starting to see these amazing dynamics between stories. So, Noah and the Ark, a far more disturbing story than we normally think. It's not just genocide, it's geocide. And it's a sort of a waste because God kills the people because they're violent, and then they're violent again. So it was ineffective. You know, there's so much about this story that's problematic when people come to this story freshly. But I never noticed this until Tom said this to me, and it sort of alerted me. A few months later, I'm reading Exodus, and I notice Moses gets set onto the Nile River in what? An ark. I thought, could it be that this story is telling us, in the previous story, we're given an image of God destroying everybody, but saving a few in the ark. But now we're given the story of God being identified with a little baby in the ark. And then you take it, and of course, when you start following these threads, now it's not God destroying everybody, throwing them in the river to drown. Now it's Pharaoh who's doing this. That's a pretty fascinating and sophisticated dialogue between those two stories. And then, of course, once you start noticing those threads in the Old Testament, it looks to me like built-in arguments in the Old Testament about God and God's violence and all the rest. Once we allow the Bible to be a repository of these sacred arguments, now I don't want to throw out the old, I just want to be the story of Noah, but I want to read it in relationship with the story of Moses. And I want to read David with Goliath in relationship to David not being able to build a temple. And something I think can happen for us Christians if we then take those threads, and this is like a whole new area of theological engagement for us, but my guess is thread after thread we're going to find coming together in Christ. One quick example of this that I wrote about in a book called Everything Must Change, I think they might have out here. Maybe, you know, it's in the top 5 most disturbing passages in the Old Testament, is Deuteronomy chapter 7. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, the land of the Hivites, Jebusites, Perizzites, Hittites. No, I don't know if the Hittites were there, the stalactites, stalagmites, and all the others. You know. 7 nations more powerful than you. When you enter this land, destroy them totally, show them no mercy, don't let your sons marry their daughters, and so on. Which, by the way, is strange. If you're going to destroy them, why would you let your sons marry their daughters? They're destroyed. So right in the text are fascinating unresolved tensions in the text itself. But there you have that passage, which, by the way, was picked up in our early history by a lot of colonial era preachers where the Pilgrims and their descendants were the children of Israel, and the native peoples were the Canaanites. And there's that tradition got picked up. It's not just theoretical. It has been used in horrible ways. Well, you take that story and you go ahead to Matthew, and you watch Matthew after the episode of the Syrophoenician woman, who Matthew identifies as a Canaanite woman. I think Luke calls her Sidonian, and maybe Mark calls her Syrophoenician. Matthew calls her Canaanite. There were no Canaanites. That would be like, you know, if calling someone of Swedish descent today a Viking. There are no Vikings today. So he intentionally reaches back and uses her past heritage to identify her as Canaanite. And so what does Jesus do? He doesn't kill her, but at first he just turns her away. But eventually, when he sees her faith, he tells her, you know, woman, you have great faith. and he grants her request, which then becomes especially interesting because Jesus' next move is to go out and preach. And in Matthew's version, you remember he's just fed the 5,000, now he feeds the 4,000. And it says that after he fed them and preached them and healed their sick, they praised the God of Israel, which suggests that he was now preaching to Gentiles. And now, in Matthew's version. And he feeds them, and how many baskets are left over? 7. So when he fed the 5,000 Jews, 12 baskets are left over. Everyone knows what that means, the reconstituting of the 12 tribes. What does this mean? Could it be that this is Matthew's way of now taking that violent story of destroying the 7 Canaanite nations? Now we're going to reconstitute the nations we've destroyed. We're going to feed and serve them a new meaning for the people of God. So you start seeing, I just wouldn't be surprised if we start tracing these things, we're going to be able to find narrative lines within this story space of creation, liberation, and reconciliation that become quite exciting and really are preachable. But can I say this is where we now have a problem of form? Because almost all of our sermons are, if you work with the lectionary, are framed by the lectionary. And I love the lectionary. It's a big improvement, I think, over not having the lectionary. But it's problematic because you can only preach one story at a time, and any relationship between texts has already been chosen for you. You don't have time to do any of these other kind of relationships. So what we might need is creative new lectionaries that start making some of these connections for us. And for the folks who don't use lectionaries, our problem is our sermons almost always focus on only one story. It's not easy to do, especially in limited time frame. How do we start to tell the stories that link stories? Because that's where so much, I think, of the framing of the biblical narrative happens. Yes? Your first name?
Sorry, my name is Dave, and I'm a pastor up in Raleigh, North Carolina. So.
And do you have a mic there? Oh, great.
I thought so. Oh.
Yeah, you're working. Good.
Is that how it works? So if this doesn't make a lot of sense, you'll understand we left at 5:30 in the morning. So.
That explains a lot for me a lot of times, too.
So far, it's worth it. Thank you. I'm interested in the idea of quest and, kind of entering into that terminology and that mindset. And what's coming together for me in the discussion this morning is, we talk about our journey of faith and our growth in faith and all that stuff, which would indicate a quest. But yet we're also rooted in denominational structures and institutional fixed entities that prevent any sort of quest. And it seems to me that's where a lot of the tension comes from. Yeah. And I'm influenced by Lauren Mead, the Once and Future Church, where he talks about leaving Christendom behind and entering into something new, a new apostolic age, I think is what he described. And we're in suburban Raleigh, and we're surrounded by, these enormous, they're not classic mega church, but these big successful churches, if you want. And how in that kind of environment, how do we talk about not competing and being on a quest?
You're raising so many important issues, and we've only got a couple minutes, so I'm going to
hurry up.
I'm going to.
I want to know.
If I go 4 or 5 minutes over, it's his fault. Okay. Okay. So you're raising several important issues that I know we need to come back to a number of times later today and tomorrow. But let me say something about denominational structures, okay? I'm a believer in institutions. I'm not an anti-institutional person. But I think what we need is a theology. I actually think we need a theology that integrates 3 realities, but I'm only going to talk about 2 of them. We need a theology that integrates institutions, movements, and communities. And I don't think those are all the same thing. But let me just say something about institutions and movements. A little definition of an institution: a human organization that preserves the gains made by past social movements. And let me define a movement as an organization that proposes gains to current institutions. Okay? If you've got that, you've got the yin and yang and dynamic tension of movements and institutions. So that means that institutions are inherently conservative, and when they oppose the gains of the next movement, you aren't surprised and you don't vilify them. You say that's what institutions do, because their primary function is to conserve gains that have been made in the past. And it's going to be with great pain that they now accept the gains proposed, but that's how change happens. And if the institution refuses the change, then the movement will either be defeated or it will have to form its own institution. And at which time, guess what? It will now work to preserve its gain and oppose the next set of gains that come along. It's just as predictable as the day is long. Now, there are institutions that learn to build in the possibility of change into the institution. But they always have this, there's always a tension. And one of the problems for our denominations is they formed in an era when they thought they were going from state to state, not state to quest. So the way you framed your question, I think, is exactly right. How can we form institutions that have better, how can we form or reform institutions that will always be inherently conservative, as they should, but can make space for reform? It's fascinating to watch this happen to denominations today. Let me give you two quick examples, and then I'll tell a quick story about a megachurch, and that'll be all the time we have. Okay. Do we have anybody here from Reformed Church in America? Any RCA folks? Any United Presbyterian or PCUSA folks? Okay. I don't know how we managed a couple. Okay. So, well, PCUSA is interesting because they just voted to reduce their book of order by 60% or 40%. Something like that. Yeah. So they reduced it by 40%. And part of their realization was when you developed policies to keep so many bad things from happening, you also can keep good things from happening. So one of your steps is to reduce the policy that makes it possible for more good things to happen. Interesting step. But the PCUSA and the RCA are in the process of doing something else that is absolutely stunning. Remember I mentioned that black theology, South Africa? Well, in the middle of that, there was a group of colored and black theologians, that's the terminology from that era in apartheid, who came up with a statement that a number of white South African theologians also signed on. It was called the Belhar Confession. And basically the Belhar Confession says, we have all these confessions about Christology, one holy Catholic Apostolic Church, all these creeds and confessions. And if you're Reformed, as the Dutch Reformed in apartheid were, you've got a whole lot of them, the Canons of Dort and Westminster and all these different confessions. Great detail. We've never had a confession that says God is just and cares about injustice. Said, it's about time. We need that. So they wrote the Belhar Confession. And so what the RCA just added the Belhar Confession to their foundational documents. Now, do you understand what that means? It's a way of saying we are not stuck in the mindset of the 17th century. We are a community that continues learning and continues articulating our faith. So by adding to their foundational documents, they didn't have to get rid of them, they relativized them. And they made the making of confessions a practice, an ongoing practice of the church in a continuing quest for understanding, rather than a box within which, out of which you can never ever move again. It's a fascinating way that this is happening. So that would be an example from a couple of denominations. A quick story about a megachurch. I think I can say this without getting anybody in trouble. One of the largest churches in the world is in San Salvador, El Salvador. It's called Elim, Elam, we would say. And it's a Pentecostal church. It was a prosperity gospel church, like a lot of Pentecostal churches, led by a powerful personality. And I understand they have between 90 and 100,000 people who attend this church. And I was in it and it has about 25,000 seats, and they fill it up 5 times or 6 times in a weekend. So I believe them. You know, a lot of numbers you don't believe, but I actually believe these numbers. And some years ago, a classic prosperity gospel, you know, tithe, give your money to the man of God, and you'll be blessed 100-fold. And those churches have a very rapid growth pattern. I doubt they'll last more than a generation and a half without radical change, because they produce a huge number of angry and disillusioned people. The kids who grow up in prosperity gospel churches tend to hate religion because they watch the pastor get richer and their parents get poorer. And once you've seen that, you don't have a good feeling about those pastors. So a very common phenomenon around the world. And but this church was at its height, and the pastor, it's very hard to get fired from one of those churches. I hope you don't mind me being a little, but this is what they said to me. There are only 2 ways to get fired from a church like ours: a dead woman or a live boy. That's the way they say it. But he actually found another way, and that was to leave with about, I think it was about $500,000. So he disappeared with the money. And that meant they needed a new pastor. And the problem is, in those kinds of churches, you tend to have a very powerful man, and everybody else, they're yes men, you know. And it's all men in this structure down the road. So they had to pick one of these yes men, and they picked a guy named Mario. And Mario now goes to be the pastor of this church. Mario is a gentle, reflective, good-hearted, sincere soul who grew up in the church and became a leader and was promoted because in many ways he was docile. But he had a conscience. And he came across a book by someone you might know, Rene Padilla, a Latin American Baptist theologian, who's maybe known as an evangelical liberation theologian, if you want to say it that way. And he found out that Rene Padilla's daughter was attending his church. Not attending church, lived in his city. And he met her, invited, said, I'd like to learn more about what your father teaches. Now, this is a patriarchal setting where women don't teach, but now the pastor invites a woman to become his mentor. And he goes through a conversion to where he no longer believes in the prosperity gospel. What does he do? If he could go and preach a sermon this Sunday that gets him fired, or he could start preaching and the numbers go down and, you know, the whole thing collapses. But he made a very tactical decision. He said, I'm going to start introducing these things, and I'm going to try to bring this congregation of 90,000 people along with me to a new, fresh understanding of the gospel. And so I was down there, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, and spent a couple days in a conference with Mario. And when I was there, his life was in danger because the presidents of a lot of countries like having influential pastors. I know this doesn't sound familiar, but like having influential pastors associated with them. And so Mario, being the biggest pastor not only in the country but in Latin America and one of the biggest in the world, the president wanted him by his side. And Mario started refusing to go because he started understanding that that relationship was compromising what he wanted to proclaim about a different narrative of the gospel. And so his life was threatened. When I was there, the only sign really that they changed, well, there was a lot of signs. Women were being given more leadership. But one of the signs was they started a recycling center, the first recycling center in the country. And he said, I know this is just symbolic, but it's one way that we start helping our people understand that the gospel is about more than getting to heaven when you die and getting rich now. The gospel is about caring for this world. So on Sunday, people come with a big basket of their papers to be recycled and their plastics to be recycled. Just kind of surprising. Bible in one hand and recycling bin in the other is how people come to church. And I was in Mario's office, and I said, well, Mario, what's the next step? And he was very silent. He said, I have to be very careful with the next step. He said, because I have young children. He said, but you know, our country has the highest, it's the murder capital of the world. Our city is the murder capital of the world. Our country has the highest per capita number of guns in the world. He says, you might not know this, but your country fought a war in my country. He said, and both Americans and Soviets were selling weapons to fight a proxy war here. As a result, we have huge numbers of weapons. He said, I must speak out against violence, and especially about gun violence. He said, but you must understand, all of our politicians are weapons dealers. So when I speak out against weapons, I will very possibly be killed. So he said, I'm really torn, because if I wait too long, I know I can't wait too long, but I also can't do this until my children are a little bit older. This is what he said to me, because he's expecting he'll be killed. So all I'm saying is but I thought to myself, this is happening in one of the largest prosperity gospel churches in the world. And all I can say is, don't write anybody off. And these changes are extremely hard in the beginning, but there comes a time where the new narrative, I think, begins to get root, and more people have the courage to adopt it. And what seems absurdly impossible now is not that absurdly impossible when you have just a little bit of patience. Does that make sense? Well, yeah, you've taken your patience. Sorry for going on. Do we have instructions now for what happens now, or?